Guys. It is my honor and privilege to be able to share the weekly presentation and message here with you guys. I posted it in the chat so you guys can follow along with the slides there. Um, Today, I wanted to talk specifically about the science of addiction and help us to get a little bit more understanding of what's actually happening on a neurological, biological, and psychological level when we're trapped in addiction, and what sorts of things psychologically make us more susceptible to addiction, and also look at how we can use that information to help overcome addiction when we're in the throngs of it. A lot of us might remember the Abbotsford flood that happened in November 2021. I remember I was sitting in a Starbucks on Whatcom Road, and I was working on a paper, and I was really just crunched in, locked in on this paper, and kind of noticed in my peripheral that people were chatting about something, and noticed that there was really heavy rainfall, but I didn't think much of it. And I was typing away and kind of noticed one by one that people were leaving the Starbucks really early, but didn't clue into what was going on. And I was typing and typing until a Starbucks employee came up and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, you need to leave." And I was like, what's going on?" And I realized I was the only person left in the Starbucks. And they said, "There's a flood that's happening right now. You need to leave." And I packed up quickly and went outside, and actually had to roll up my pants and walk with a group of probably 20 or 30 people. It felt like we were going across the Nile River, the Red Sea. But yeah, I had water up to my thighs walking in the flood, and saw it kind of coming into Castle Fun Park, and it was just wild to me to see how fast these waters came in and swallowed everything in their path. And it was scary to witness these waters rising so quickly and destroying everything. And the streams and the rivers that we rely on to nourish our land, they couldn't handle the flood. They were overwhelmed, they were reshaped, and in some cases, they were completely washed away. And in a very similar way, our brains operate that way. They have a natural system of streams or neural pathways or circuits that are activated by a chemical called dopamine. And dopamine helps us to experience pleasure, and it motivates us to repeat healthy behaviors in a healthy way. And in a healthy brain, these streams are flowing steadily and nourish our lives. We feel joy from meaningful relationships, eating delicious meals, making love with our spouses, completing challenging projects, or pursuing hobbies. And these dopamines that are released in these moments are reinforcing these behaviors and strengthening the streams in our life from the brain's reward system, so that we are encouraged to repeat the behaviors again. But in the addicted brain, it's like that Abbotsford flood. Instead of a steady flow of dopamine rushing in, it's fast, it's ugly, and it's out of control. The flood rush overwhelms our natural streams, washing them away and creating new, unnatural channels of addiction. And the worst part is that when the flood dries up, it leaves behind a barren, dry landscape. The natural streams, the healthy sources of joy and connection, are gone, or they're barely flowing. The brain becomes like parched land, and the only way to feel relief is to trigger another flood by returning to the addictive behavior. But each time the flood gets worse, and the natural streams are further eroded, leaving the person trapped in a vicious cycle. So you can see some photos there that I've posted of the Abbotsford flood. It was absolutely wild. Of course, Castle Fun Park got the brunt end of it, and we didn't get to go there for quite a long time. And then you can see a photo there of beautiful streams, of what healthy streams look like, and you can see how that looks a lot more healthy than the results of a flood. I have that photo there. You can kind of zoom up on the brain, and I can give a little bit of insight into to what some of these things mean. So we have our prefrontal cortex, and that's the kind of front end of our brain, and that's what helps us to make proper decisions, and helps us with impulse control. And what addiction does is it damages that prefrontal cortex. The more we are susceptible to addiction, the more we are engaged in it, the longer it proceeds. the more damage that's done to our prefrontal cortex, which actually makes it harder to resist in the future. You can also see the ventral tegmental area, and this is the area that produces dopamine. And when addiction happens, it becomes hyperactive and it leads to constant cravings for the addictive substance. And then we have the nucleus accumbens. That's kind of halfway between the two. And this is where the pleasure feeling is produced and it's desensitized. So, what is addiction? There are many definitions of addiction. Uh, the APA defines addiction as a state of psychological or physical dependence on the use of drugs or other substances, such as alcohol, or on activities or behaviors. The term is often used as an equivalent term for substance use disorder or substance dependence and can be applied to non-substance related behavioral addictions, such as sex, exercise, or gambling. I like this definition. It's called the ABCDEs of addiction. And this is kind of a good definition for trying to understand if you might fall into the addiction category. So the A is abstain. If you have inability to consistently abstain. The B is behavioral control. If you have impairment in your behavioral control. C is craving or an increased hunger for drugs or the rewarding experience. D is diminished recognitions of significant problems with one's behavior and interpersonal relationships. And E is your emotional response, which becomes dysfunctional the more the addiction prolongs. So I want to talk about the three chemicals that are being released when we engage in addictive behaviors. So the brain is composed of different parts, including our reward system, and God designed this. So the reward neural pathway of releases a chemical we talked about called dopamine. This is the first chemical, the most obvious one. It creates feelings of pleasure, satisfaction, vitality, and excitement. Again, it encourages us to repeat and engage in beneficial activities and also encodes these behaviors into memory, making them more habitual. However, addictive behaviors like pornography overwhelm our reward system. It floods it with high levels of dopamine, which feel amazing, and it floods this reward neural pathway up to 10 times more than a natural reward. It essentially tricks the brain into prioritizing the addictive behavior and encourages the harmful behavior. And the higher the dopamine peak, the greater the stimulation and rush is, and the greater the crash is after. The next chemical that's released in the brain is called serotonin. In contrast to dopamine, serotonin promotes a longer lasting sensation of satisfaction and emotional balance. When we engage in healthy dopamine producing activities like eating food or connecting with other people, serotonin provides a sense of contentment and stability. But with pornography, the intense dopamine rush is followed by a sharp crash, and serotonin is not present to restore our feelings of balance. Over time, this imbalance leads to increased vulnerability to mental health conditions like depression or anxiety or impulsive behavior, which further fuels our reliance on the addiction. The lack of serotonin calming our system creates an emotional void, which users often try to fill by returning to the addictive behavior, creating a perpetual cycle. The next chemical released between synapses and neurons in the brain is called oxytocin. And this is a chemical that's actually missing when we're engaging in this addictive behavior. Oxytocin is called the bonding hormone, and it's released during moments of trust, intimacy, or connection, such as sex, hugging, or deep emotional bonding with others. And this hormone fosters feelings of closeness and security in relationships. Pornography can mimic these intimate moments, which releases a small amount of oxytocin, but not nearly the same amount produced during real human connection. And when we're over-reliant on porn, it diminishes the brain's sensitivity to oxytocin, making it harder to bond with others. Whether it's connecting emotionally with a spouse or forming meaningful friendships, the diminished ability to bond increases feelings of loneliness and isolation, which can push individuals back toward pornography as a source of relief, again adding to that vicious cycle. However, when we intentionally foster genuine friendships and connections, our need for this false intimacy of porn diminishes and we begin to restore the brain's natural balance. As time in the addiction prolongs, the brain adapts and reduces dopamine receptor sensitivity and begins to build a tolerance. The tolerance creates a downward spiral where the user is now seeking more and more intense or frequent stimulation to achieve the same level of high. For the porn user, this could mean seeking out more and more intense or novel pornographic content to achieve the same levels of high. Content that we once said, no, that's out of bounds. I'm not ever going to go there. Uh, Content that we think would have been unimaginable for us to begin to partake in when we began the addiction becomes more and more likely to be justified, leading to greater consequences for the user. When there's chronic dopamine overstimulation, the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which manages our impulse control and decision making, becomes damaged, making it that much harder to resist urges, even when the person recognizes the harm that's being done. Further, as the addiction prolongs, the brain begins to form neural connections between addictive substances and triggers, which are things that cause a dopamine rush to begin even before the activity or substance is used. And this is called the cue reward loop. And we feel this for good things. Every time I drive up to the keg with my wife, my mouth starts to water, thinking about that top sirloin I'm going to enjoy. But the brain also learns this for harmful things. For example, an alcoholic might already begin to feel the effects of dopamine when driving past a bar or a liquor store. An opioid user might feel this surge when meeting with his drug dealer. And the porn user, when he is alone or using an unmonitored device, he might begin to feel that surge as well. And this encourages us to partake in the behavior and increases our chance of relapse by giving us a taste of what's to come before we've even acted out. That's why I believe Jesus says, if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If that device, lonely environment, mood, or whatever precedes the sin causes you to sin, cut it off. Pray to the Holy Spirit that we could recognize our triggers and throw them away before the temptation becomes insurmountable. Another effect of chronic dopamine stimulation on the brain is that the things that used to bring us satisfaction or joy, like spousal intimacy, work, friends, hobbies, these become less and less satisfying to the desensitized brain. This is caused primarily by the depleted levels of serotonin, as mentioned earlier, but further strengthened because the neural pathways that used to support these things that we used to like engaging in weaken the less they are used. Addiction has a huge impact on us, especially when we start at a young age. Ideally, we could stop addiction by never opening the door to it in the first place. That's why, as fathers and leaders, our stories of redemption and the harm that was inflicted on us and how we overcame it can be powerful in helping steer the next generation away from porn addiction, which is now more prevalent and accessible than ever before. The earlier the exposure to pornography begins, the greater its impact on brain development, making it harder to break free from addiction as a result. A study by Gustavo Mesh found that the average age children are exposed to porn is around 12 years old, though other research suggests this can occur as early as 8 to 11 years old, with 15% being exposed by age 10 and some as young as 5 years old. The earlier a person begins consuming porn, the more deeply the associated neural pathways become hardwired in the brain. And this is particularly significant during the brain's developmental stage when it's highly malleable, making addiction more challenging to break later on in life. Mesh's study also noted that adolescents who regularly consume porn appear less socially integrated and more socially marginal. They express less commitment to their families, fewer pro-social attitudes, they have less attachment to school, and they're becoming so preoccupied with what they're viewing and how it makes them feel that they lose touch with their surroundings and their relationships. Further, early and repeated exposure to porn has been linked to increased likelihood of mental health struggles, including depression and anxiety, and issues in emotional and sexual relations later on. Instead of developing natural emotional regulation skills to navigate feelings like stress, boredom, sadness, or any difficult emotion, children turn to porn and use it as a coping mechanism. And this reliance diminishes their ability to develop productive coping strategies later in life. It also disrupts their capacity to form meaningful relations, often distorting their understanding of sexuality, boundaries, and relationships. At a young age, the brain is prematurely associating sexual content with pleasure, reinforcing addictive patterns and skewed ideas of what healthy sexuality looks like. The overwhelming content viewed at such a young age contributes to feelings of secrecy, guilt, and shame, which intensify compulsive behaviors and increase the risk of developing things like phobias or anxiety. Porn then can act as a surrogate for real intimacy, offering a false sense of connection without the risks associated with building genuine relationship. However, this reliance damages the brain's reward receptors, making it harder to experience joy or pleasure from normal, healthy activities and social connections. This effect leaves individuals increasingly drawn to the artificial high provided by porn, which again works to perpetuate that addictive cycle. So if we know the harm caused by addictions, why do people turn to addictions in the first place? Of course, there's always the chance that somebody is perfectly fine, they're perfectly happy and content in life, and they turn to porn out of just an unhealthy curiosity, out of boredom, out of opportunity. Maybe it's peer pressure to fit in with friends, or it's just on a whim when it's presented to you unexpectedly. However, for many, addiction can offer an escape. Dr. Gabor Mate explains that a significant number of people turn to addictions like porn to numb or escape vulnerable feelings such as depression, loneliness, stress, anger, and trauma, and even trauma that might not be consciously remembered. Soul wounds at a young age make us especially vulnerable to addiction. The brain is wired for two primary goals: survival and reproduction. When a child experiences neglect or abuse at an extremely young age, the brain interprets these experiences as a signal that they're unlovable, unworthy, or unseen. In order to survive emotionally, the child learns to cope and self-soothe on their own, often without the support of a caregiver. As this child learns that they can't rely on their mother and father to regulate their own emotions, they develop withdrawn or insecure attachment styles and use harmful self-soothing techniques to cope. While this coping mechanisms helps ensure survival in the short term, the deeply embedded belief of being unlovable often persists into adulthood, shaping how individuals relate to themselves and others. Often they begin to form beliefs like, I'm unworthy of love, I can't trust others, I have to rely on myself because no one else cares for me or meets my needs. And this becomes deeply embedded beliefs about somebody's identity that they'll carry into adulthood. Without learning the emotional co-regulation that comes from a caregiver, children may grow up to rely on external sources for comfort, such as using porn. Poor attachment also makes emotional connection with others more difficult, creating a heightened need to escape loneliness. Porn offers a temporary relief from these painful feelings, providing a dopamine-driven escape. However, this relief is short-lived and often followed by shame. The shame reinforces this secrecy, which compounds the emotional burden and leads to a cycle of using porn to numb the feelings of shame. This adds to the negative spiral of addiction. Childhood sexual and physical abuse, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder, also increase dependence on addictive substances like porn. Abuse or trauma activates our fight, flight, or freeze response, which floods the brain with the stress hormone called cortisol. And repeated activation of this response can lead to dysregulation in our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis of the brain, which is responsible for managing stress. This dysregulation makes individuals more prone to feelings of anxiety, hypervigilance, and emotional overwhelm. During traumatic episodes, the fight, flight, or freeze response is designed to protect us in that moment. However, when these responses are repeated or the trauma is not properly processed in our body, the stress becomes stored physiologically and in our minds, leaving individuals in a continual state of hyperarousal, chronic stress, or emotional shutdown. This state disrupts a person's ability to feel safe, calm, and well-connected and creates a sense of being on edge. the dopamine high associated with porn temporarily relieves these painful feelings, creating a reliance on the porn as a coping mechanism. Over time, the dependence grows as we increasingly turn to porn to escape emotional dysregulation and create stronger and stronger neural pathways that habitually turn us to porn whenever we feel upset. In cases of sexual abuse, the brain may form neural pathways that associate sexual sensations with feelings like pain, fear, or helplessness. And this can lead to two different patterns of coping. There can be hypersexuality, where some individuals use porn compulsively as a way to rewrite or take control of painful memories of abuse, often processing the trauma dissociatively through the content. And there can also be emotional numbing. Others might use the porn to disconnect from the physical and emotional feelings tied to sexual intimacy, further avoiding vulnerability in real relationship. Both patterns create a feedback loop of addiction where relief from porn reinforces its use, deepening dependence and preventing the resolution of the underlying trauma. Finally, porn can also create a false sense of connection that temporarily relieves feelings of loneliness or relational dissatisfaction. We mentioned that chemical oxytocin, which is released when we bond with a partner. This is temporarily bypassed to relieve the brain's craving for authentic intimacy and connection. But of course, soon after the high is worn off, the need for connection soon returns, and that feeling of loneliness surges back, forcing us to depend on porn. Porn also works to objectify individuals. It rewires our brain to view people as objects for gratification rather than individuals bearing God's image, which can undermine the depth of our real relationships. Many people hooked on porn can begin to like the safety of it. They like the control it gives them over their sexual experiences as it removes them from facing feelings of rejection or judgment that can come in our real relationships. The fried dopamine receptors further add barriers to making efforts to seek out and build meaningful friendships and romantic relationships. And the dopamine and oxytocin released when in connection with friends or partners reduces and becomes less rewarding. So our real connections with people in real life, they become less rewarding as those dopamine receptors become desensitized. Thankfully, there is freedom from addiction. God did not make our brains hardwired against change, but through a process called neuroplasticity, we are able to break free from addiction with hard work. The overwhelmed dopamine receptors can restore balance over time as we abstain from porn, as well as porn triggers and seek out activities that produce healthy sources of dopamine. A common phrase in psychology is that neurons that fire together wire together. This means that the brain will gradually strengthen the pathways we use most often and weaken the ones we choose to neglect. That's why, for instance, it might seem really hard to work out at first, but the more you do it, the more it becomes part of your routine and habit, the easier it becomes. In the same way, the more we resist pornography, the more we avoid tempting environments and the cue reward loop, the weaker these neural pathways will become as well. But it's often not enough to simply quit the addictive behavior. It's better to replace it. I have a short clip I want to share from Dr. Gabor Mate. He specializes in working with addiction, and he worked a lot in the downtown east side, helping the homeless population there and trying to understand more what was happening for them. So I'm going to quickly...
People addicted to pornography, they're not actually after the pornography. It's not about sex. It's about a temporary spike of dopamine in their brain. Dopamine being the brain chemical that makes us feel alive and vital and present and excited and curious. Now, so in other words, something happened to this man to shut down that mechanism, so he needed the extreme stimulation and titillation of pornography to get that dopamine spike so he can feel really alive. He just wanted to feel alive, that's all he wanted. Then he connects with the boxing community, and he gets himself going physically, and he gets his engagement with the group. All of a sudden he gets his needs met in a much healthier way. So again, to criticize him and ostracize him and to shame him as he shamed himself, he just wanted to feel like a normal human being. That's all he wanted.
Yeah, I really love that clip because it can speak to some of the underlying needs that are happening that we've been mentioning. And for a lot of guys, that can just be a deep need to feel like they want to connect with other people. And they might not even consciously be aware of that, but we all have drives. We're wired for connection. When we try to cold turkey quit the addiction, the boredom, restlessness, and emotional unfulfillment leaves us more susceptible to relapse. But by replacing the addiction with healthier behaviors, like in this case, it was boxing, but maybe for you, that's volunteering at church, joining a worship team, joining a hockey team, or more, we can fill that void that porn might have been filling in a way healthier way. This might feel incredibly hard to do at first. You might not feel like engaging in your once loved hobbies and feel depleted and sad, but give it time. You need to rebuild your tolerance. You need to rebuild your dopamine receptors, and it'll happen as you're consistent. The urge to use will be intense in these moments, but I encourage you guys to force yourself to be consistent in partaking in alternatives and forming these new neural pathways that will grow as the old ones deplete. We also know here that the opposite of addiction is what? It's connection. We talk about that a lot. By joining groups and reconnecting with our spouses as well as other guys will help to replace that part of porn that fuels and relieves our hunger for authentic connection. To speed up this dopamine restoration process, you can engage in simple activities like exercise at the gym, resistance training, cardio, or even light walks. All of these produce healthy levels of dopamine and help to restore our dopamine receptors. Further, we want to avoid not only the addiction itself, but the triggers that activate the neural pathways and habits, the cue reward loop. If a certain non-pornographic website starts to embed lustful thoughts, I encourage you guys to stay away from that website. If being home alone, especially at first when we're trying to recovery, if that activates that cue reward loop because of the opportunity, plan to not be home alone during your recovery phase. I encourage you, as I mentioned before, to pray, ask the Holy Spirit to reveal to you what some of your personal triggers might be, and let's remove the footholds that we could give to the enemy. I also encourage you, if you feel like you might be one of those people that have suffered from unresolved or unprocessed trauma, from childhood abuse or neglect, if you struggle with loneliness or just generalized depression or anxiety, I encourage you to seek help to work on the underlying feelings and beliefs that might prompt you to turn to pornography for relief. There's many therapeutic modalities, a lot that we use here at DFR, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is called EMDR, somatic experience. All of these modalities treat trauma by helping you to process it in a controlled space to decrease its hold on your life. Further, counseling can help us overcome relational problems and depression and anxiety. It can help us to form meaningful relations with others, again, helping us to replace the false sense of relationship that porn brings. Alongside that, we could join church groups like Freedom Session. We can make sure to be engaged in prayer and church activities, in exercise, having a proper diet and sleep routine. All of this can help to work on those underlying beliefs or feelings about ourselves that cause anxiety and depression. I hope that these biological and psychological insights into porn addiction can help us to replace feelings of shame with a deeper understanding of what is happening internally and help us to be mindful and one step ahead of the addiction process. Instead of a downward spiral toward defeat, I believe with God's help and healing, we can create an upward spiral to victory. Thank you guys for your time.